The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that settled thick in the air, pressing against every person in attendance. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, reflecting off the polished wooden surfaces of the judge's bench and the long tables where the prosecution and defense sat. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee gone cold, the kind of scent that lingered in places where people fought over justice and lives were changed with the stroke of a gavel. Charlotte Hale sat motionless at the defendant's table, her wrist bound in cold metal cuffs. She didn't fidget, didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat. Instead, she sat with her back straight, chin slightly lifted, watching as the courtroom murmured around her. To anyone else, she looked calm, unbothered even, but beneath the surface, her mind was running at full speed, breaking down every detail, every possible outcome. The prosecuting attorney, a man in his late 40s with neatly combed hair and a crisp navy blue suit, cleared his throat before addressing the jury. Charlotte Hale, he began, his voice carrying across the room, is charged with unlawful entry, obstruction of justice, and the attempted theft of confidential materials. A decorated CIA agent, someone who swore to uphold the law, now finds herself on the other side of it. The evidence will show that she was caught trespassing in the home of NYPD Captain David Langston in the middle of the night. Langston, seated in the witness stand, kept his expression neutral, though there was something too controlled about the way he sat. His hands rested perfectly still on the edge of the stand, his gaze unwavering. He was playing his part well. The jury members exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, as if already buying into the prosecutor's narrative. Others seemed less convinced, but doubt had been planted. That was all the prosecution needed. At the defense table, Charlotte's attorney, Ethan Cole, sat rigid. His eyes flicked toward her briefly, a silent question hanging between them. "What do we do here?" Charlotte met his gaze but said nothing. She was waiting. The prosecutor took a slow step toward the center of the room. "Now, to ensure absolute clarity," he continued, "the prosecution would like to present key evidence that leaves no room for doubt." With a click of a button, the courtroom monitor lit up. A grainy black and white surveillance video played, showing a shadowed figure moving toward Langston's home, slipping into the side entrance. Murmurs rippled through the room. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but the posture, the way the figure moved, it could have been her. The prosecutor turned, leveling his gaze at Charlotte. "Would you like to explain to the court why you were sneaking into Captain Langston's private residence after midnight?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her. He knew the video was bad. Without a way to counter it, things were looking grim. Charlotte exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, before finally speaking. "If that video is real," she said, her voice carrying through the tension, "then why is the most important part missing?" The prosecutor faltered, just for a second, but Charlotte caught it. So did the judge, who narrowed his eyes slightly. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Some jurors straightened in their seats, intrigued. Langston's hands twitched against the wooden railing. Before the prosecutor could regain his composure, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A uniformed officer strode in quickly, making his way toward the judge's bench. He leaned in, whispering something that only the judge could hear. Whatever it was enough to make the older man's brows knit together in a frown. He sat back in his chair, exhaled through his nose, then turned to the courtroom. "This trial is temporarily adjourned," he declared. "We will reconvene at a later time." The courtroom erupted into noise. The jury looked confused, the prosecutor flustered. Langston's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. Charlotte, however, remained still, a faint glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She knew exactly what had just happened. "But before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you." 48 hours earlier, I wasn't the one on trial. I was the one searching for the truth. It was nearly midnight, and the Bronx had the kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, the occasional flicker of a neon sign cutting through the darkness. Stray voices echoed from alleyways, conversations slipping in and out of earshot like ghosts. Charlotte Hale moved through the streets with practiced ease, blending into the shadows. Her leather jacket, zipped up against the cold, hugged her frame as she kept her hands tucked into her pockets. She wasn't supposed to be here, not officially at least. The CIA had flagged this meeting as suspicious, but no one in the agency was willing to intervene. Too much red tape. Too many risks. That was the problem with bureaucracy. It got in the way of real work. So Charlotte took it upon herself to follow up. Ahead, a small parking lot sat empty, except for a single black sedan, its engine idling. Under the flickering glow of a street lamp, two men stood a few feet apart. One of them, Mike Herrera, was a veteran NYPD officer with a reputation for being just crooked enough to stay out of trouble. The other man was unfamiliar, his suit too crisp, his posture too controlled, definitely not local. Charlotte stopped at the edge of the lot, listening. "You tell your boss the numbers need to change," Herrera muttered, his voice just above a whisper. "I can't keep covering the same ground without—" The businessman raised a hand, cutting him off. "This is not a negotiation. You either take the deal or we find someone else to handle it." Herrera's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he handed over a small envelope. Charlotte couldn't see what was inside, but the exchange was clear. A payoff. She moved to adjust the small camera embedded in her collar when a sudden movement caught her eye. A boy, maybe 11 or 12, lingering just outside the circle of light. Charlotte frowned. The kid looked out of place. Too young, too nervous. His hands clutched at the straps of a worn-out backpack, his body hunched as if trying to disappear into the night. And then she saw what he was watching. A uniformed cop stood over him, leaning in too close, speaking in a low tone. The boy took a step back, but the cop grabbed his arm, his grip tightening. Charlotte's stomach knotted. Whatever this kid had, it was enough to make him a target. Her focus shifted back to Herrera and his associate. The businessman was already getting back into his car. Herrera pulled out his phone, typing something before turning toward the street. Charlotte exhaled. She had what she needed. Proof of corruption, a lead to something bigger. But the boy, she had to make a choice. Charlotte crossed the street, keeping her steps casual. The officer holding the boy's arm barely glanced at her, but the kid did. His eyes darted up, wide with fear. "Hey," Charlotte said smoothly. "I think you dropped something." She crouched, pretending to reach for something on the ground. It was enough of a distraction for the boy to yank his arm free. "Run," she muttered under her breath. The kid didn't hesitate. He bolted down the alley, disappearing into the dark. The officer barely had time to react before Charlotte straightened, flashing him a polite but firm smile. "Problem here, officer?" His face twisted with irritation. "Stay out of this." She shrugged. "Just making sure you're not scaring kids for fun." The officer hesitated, then muttered something under his breath before turning away. Charlotte didn't move until she was sure he was gone. A minute later, she found the kid crouched behind a dumpster, breathing hard. "You okay?" she asked. The boy looked at her, skeptical. He was small, probably no older than 12, his face smeared with dirt, clothes worn thin from too many nights outside. He clutched his backpack so tightly his knuckles were white. "You followed me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you watching them," Charlotte replied. "Figured you were in trouble." The boy hesitated, then finally nodded. "My name's Jordan," he said, "and I think I stole something really bad." Charlotte and Jordan sat on the edge of a loading dock, just outside an old warehouse. He unzipped his bag carefully as if the contents might explode. Inside, beneath layers of crumpled clothes and a half-eaten candy bar, was a small silver USB drive. "I found it behind a police station," Jordan explained. "It was just sitting there in the trash. But when I plugged it into a library computer, there were all these numbers and names. It didn't make sense, but—" Charlotte's stomach twisted. "But the next day, I saw a guy watching me." Jordan swallowed. "Then another. They keep showing up wherever I go." Charlotte took the USB, rolling it between her fingers. If Jordan had found something connected to Herrera's deal, then he had stumbled onto something massive. "You're right to be scared," she admitted, "but you did the right thing." Jordan shifted. "What do I do now?" Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, then froze. Somewhere nearby, a car door slammed shut. She turned just in time to see three men stepping out of a black SUV. The same SUV from the parking lot. Jordan's eyes widened. They found me. Charlotte didn't hesitate. Run! They barely made it 2 blocks before sirens erupted behind them. Red and blue lights slashed through the night. Charlotte pulled Jordan into a side alley, pressing her back against the brick wall. But it was too late. Freeze! A voice boomed through the night. A line of NYPD officers blocked both ends of the alley. Jordan pressed himself against Charlotte, panic written all over his face. She reached for his backpack, shoving the USB back inside. Then David Langston stepped forward, a slow, smug smile creeping across his face. Well, well, he said. What do we have here? Charlotte exhaled through her nose. This was a setup. She raised her hand slowly, watching as Langston signaled his officers forward. The cuffs snapped around her wrists, cold, familiar. Jordan took a step back, his face pale. Charlotte locked eyes with him, willing him to stay quiet. Then Langston leaned in, voice just for her. You should have stayed out of this. Charlotte smiled. And you should have covered your tracks better. Langston's expression flickered, just for a second. Then they shoved her into the squad car, and the world spun away. And that was how I ended up in that courtroom. Being arrested was bad, but knowing that I was being framed, that was worse. The room was small, sterile, and reeked of old coffee and sweat. A single overhead light buzzed, flickering slightly, casting uneven shadows on the gray walls. The metal chair beneath Charlotte was bolted to the floor, as was the table in front of her. The kind of setup designed to make someone feel trapped, powerless. But Charlotte Hale wasn't easily intimidated. Across from her, David Langston sat with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His uniform was crisp, badge gleaming under the dim light. His hands, clasped loosely together, rested on the table, exuding the kind of casual authority that made her skin crawl. You know, you could make this easy on yourself, he said, his tone almost friendly. Just tell us what you were doing outside my house, and maybe we can work something out. Charlotte didn't flinch. She held his gaze, measuring every micro-expression, every flicker of amusement in his eyes. You think if you keep saying it, it'll make it true? She asked, tilting her head slightly. That I was at your house? That's an interesting story. Too bad it's not mine. Langston smirked, reaching for a manila folder beside him. He flipped it open with deliberate slowness, revealing a stack of photos. One, placed neatly on top, was a grainy black and white still shot. Someone moving toward a side entrance of a house. It could have been her, except it wasn't. Looks pretty clear to me, he said, tapping the photo. You were seen entering my property. Unauthorized, late at night. Now let's say I'm feeling generous. You tell me what you were after, and maybe I don't push for the maximum sentence. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her expression unchanging. You know what I think, Langston? I think you wanted this to be clear. Too clear. He chuckled, shaking his head. Always the conspiracy theorist. She sat back, exhaling slowly through her nose. The video was fake. She knew it, but proving it was a different matter. She had no access to the original footage, no way to discredit it here. That meant one thing. She was stuck, at least for now. Langston studied her reaction carefully before flipping the folder shut. Well, he said, standing, I was hoping we could avoid the mess, but I see you're going to make this difficult. He adjusted his cuffs, rolling his shoulders slightly before stepping toward the door. You'll come around. They always do. Before he could leave, Charlotte spoke, her voice casual. And if I don't? He paused just for a second. Then he glanced over his shoulder, eyes gleaming with something darker. You can keep your mouth shut, he said smoothly. But that kid, he won't. Charlotte's stomach turned cold. Langston gave a small, satisfied nod, as if he could see the impact of his words sinking in. Then, without another word, he stepped out, letting the heavy steel door slam shut behind him. Charlotte's pulse pounded in her ears. Jordan! She knew he was in danger, but hearing Langston confirm it sent a fresh wave of urgency through her veins. The longer she sat here, the more time they had to find the boy and silence him, if they hadn't already. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. She needed to get out of here. A guard entered not long after, offering her a single phone call. She wasted no time dialing Ethan Cole. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered, laced with irritation. "This better be good." "Get me out," she said flatly. There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "Tell me you didn't—" "I didn't," she cut in. "But they think I did. And they've got a video to back it up." Ethan muttered something under his breath. "Of course they do." She heard movement, the rustling of papers, the clicking of a keyboard. "Okay, I'm on my way. Don't say anything until I get there." "Wasn't planning on it." 30 minutes later, Ethan arrived at the precinct. Tall, clean-cut, and exuding an air of reluctant professionalism, he strode in like he owned the place. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, as if he'd thrown it on in a hurry. But his eyes were sharp, scanning the room as he made his way toward her. Langston was already waiting. "You're wasting your time, Cole," he said, arms crossed over his chest. "Your client's not going anywhere." Ethan didn't so much as blink. "I'll take my chances." The two men locked eyes, a silent power struggle playing out between them. Charlotte watched, amused, as Ethan finally broke the tension by holding up a stack of papers. "She's being detained unlawfully," he said, voice steady. "There's no warrant for her arrest, and no evidence proving intent. You know as well as I do that a grainy video isn't enough to hold her." Langston smiled, slow and smug. "She was trespassing on an officer's property. That's more than enough for a judge." Ethan returned the smile, just as cold. "Then let's take it to a judge." Langston exhaled sharply, looking almost disappointed. "You really want to play that game?" "You know me," Ethan replied. "I love a good legal battle." For a moment it seemed like it might work, but then Langston's expression shifted, and Charlotte knew before he even spoke that they had planned for this. "The judge has already denied bail," Langston said smoothly. "Given the nature of the charges and her history, she's staying put." Charlotte clenched her jaw. Ethan looked genuinely taken aback. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "This is—" Langston cut him off with a casual shrug. "Oh, and before you try to appeal, you should know. The evidence against her just got stronger." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, rolling it between his fingers. "Let's just say we have more than just that video." Charlotte felt her nails press into her palms. They were stacking the deck. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around his briefcase. He turned to Charlotte, frustration flickering in his eyes. "I'll keep fighting this, but it's going to take time." Time she didn't have. Charlotte looked back at Langston, masking the storm brewing inside her. She knew his type, men who played the long game, who built their careers on knowing how to stay one step ahead. But they always had one weakness: overconfidence. If Langston thought she was just going to sit back and let this play out, he was in for a surprise. If they thought I was going to sit back and let them win, they had no idea who they were dealing with. If I couldn't beat the system from the inside, I had to get outside. Charlotte sat on the edge of the narrow cot in her holding cell, staring at the cold concrete wall as if it might give her answers. The air smelled of sweat, bleach, and stale coffee, a combination she had learned to ignore. The rhythmic buzz of fluorescent lights overhead pulsed like a dull headache in the background. She knew what Langston wanted. He wanted her to panic, to feel trapped. He wanted her to accept that she had lost before the real fight had even begun. That wasn't going to happen. CIA protocol was clear. Agents caught in legal trouble were on their own unless their cover was at risk. If she called them now, it wouldn't just be her name on trial. It would be her entire career, her reputation. And if Langston had fabricated this much evidence against her, there was no telling what else he had in his pocket. She needed a different way out, one that didn't leave her with more questions than answers. Ethan arrived at the precinct an hour later, his expression set in something between determination and exhaustion. He dropped his briefcase on the interrogation table and loosened his tie, his usual tell when he was about to fight a legal battle he wasn't sure he could win. "You look comfortable," he said, gesturing at her seat. Charlotte smirked. "It's the 5-star accommodations." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of his nose before flipping open his case. "All right, here's the problem. Langston's got the judge in his pocket. Bail was denied outright. They're pushing for an expedited trial, which means they want you locked up and out of the way as fast as possible." Charlotte leaned forward. Then we slow them down. Ethan hesitated. That's the thing. I think I found something. She raised an eyebrow. Langston's arrest warrant? He continued. It was filed incorrectly. There's a jurisdictional oversight. Technically, your case should fall under federal oversight, not local. That means the NYPD had no legal right to detain you without first notifying a federal judge. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Which means, Ethan said, leaning in, I just filed a motion with the district court. By law, they have to release you while they reassess the case. You've got a 24-hour window before they can detain you again. It wasn't freedom, but it was a start. She nodded. Good work. Ethan gave her a pointed look. Don't waste it. The paperwork took hours to push through, but eventually a tired-looking officer unlocked Charlotte's cuffs and led her toward the station's exit. Langston was nowhere in sight, but she knew better than to assume he didn't already have another move planned. The night air was thick with the promise of rain as she stepped outside. The city hummed around her, horns blaring, street vendors packing up, the scent of grilled food and gasoline clinging to the humidity. She exhaled, inhaling something that almost felt like relief. Almost. She wasn't alone. Charlotte had spent years honing the ability to sense when someone was watching her. The weight of an unbroken stare, the shift in energy when a presence lingered too long. It was an instinct as familiar as breathing. She didn't turn her head right away. Instead, she adjusted her jacket, glancing at the glass of a nearby car window, just enough to catch a reflection. A man. Dark hoodie, angled stance. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't pretending to wait for a ride. He was watching her. Charlotte moved. She turned onto a side street, walking at a casual pace, just fast enough to see if he followed. He did. Her pulse stayed steady as she maneuvered through the city's veins, weaving between parked cars and dimly lit alleys. The man stayed close but never too close, keeping the exact distance of someone who didn't want to be noticed. But he had underestimated who he was following. Charlotte cut sharply down a narrow alley, ducking behind a dumpster and waiting. Footsteps approached. As soon as he stepped into view, she moved. In a blink, she had him shoved against the wall, one arm pinned behind his back. "Who sent you?" she demanded, pressing her forearm against his shoulder. The man tensed but didn't struggle. He wasn't a random thug. He had training. Charlotte leaned in. "You're not NYPD, and you sure as hell aren't street muscle. So tell me, who do you work for?" The man remained silent. Then with a quick shift, he twisted just enough to slip from her grip and step backward, out of reach. For the first time, he spoke. "You're looking in the wrong place," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Before Charlotte could react, he tossed something to the ground, a small folded piece of paper. Then he disappeared into the night. Charlotte bent down, unfolding the note. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "Find the boy, or lose him forever." Her stomach clenched. Jordan. She shoved the note into her pocket, already moving. They weren't just after her, they were after him. She wasn't just fighting to clear her name anymore. She was saving his life. I was free, but I wasn't safe, and neither was Jordan. Charlotte moved quickly through the city, the night air thick with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional blare of sirens. She had spent enough time in the Bronx to know which streets to avoid, which alleys led to dead ends, and which ones offered a chance to disappear. She needed to move fast. Jordan's life depended on it. The note she had found earlier played over in her mind. Find the boy, or lose him forever. She didn't have time to question who had left it or why. There was only one thing she knew for certain. Jordan was being hunted, and she wasn't the only one looking for him. Felix lived in a cluttered apartment above a bodega, the kind of place where the blinds were always drawn, and the faint glow of multiple screens flickered through the gaps. Charlotte knocked once before letting herself in. The room was a mess of cables, old pizza boxes, and the distinct smell of burnt coffee. Felix, a wiry man in his mid-30s with thick glasses and a tattered hoodie, barely looked up from his keyboard as she entered. "You look like hell," he muttered, typing rapidly. Charlotte crossed her arms. "And you look like someone who still owes me a favor." Felix sighed, finally turning to face her. "What do you need?" She pulled out her phone, showing him a blurry image of Jordan. The kid, he's missing. I need to know where he was last seen. Felix studied the photo, then nodded. Give me a sec. His fingers flew across the keyboard, tapping into security systems that weren't exactly public access. Charlotte paced behind him, her jaw tight as she waited. Then the screen flickered. Felix leaned in. Got something, he said, clicking on a grainy video feed. Charlotte stepped forward. The footage showed a rundown residential street, a dimly lit doorway. Jordan. The boy burst out of a small apartment complex, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He sprinted across the cracked pavement, glancing over his shoulder. 15 seconds later, a black SUV rolled into frame. The headlights flicked on. The vehicle slowed. Pause it, Charlotte ordered. Felix hit the spacebar. She studied the SUV, memorizing the details. Can you run the plate? Felix nodded, typing furiously. A few moments later, a result popped up. Belongs to a guy named Mike Herrera, NYPD. Been with the department 12 years. Felix frowned. He's got a disciplinary record. Whispers about him taking money under the table, but nothing ever stuck. Charlotte's fingers curled into fists. Herrera wasn't just some beat cop. He was connected. And if he was involved in this, Jordan was in even more danger than she had thought. She turned to Felix. Where does he go when he's not playing cop? Felix smirked, clicking a few more keys. There's a bar, low-key, no cameras, just outside the precinct. If he's dirty, he drinks there. Charlotte grabbed her jacket. Send me the address. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale beer clung to the air. Charlotte spotted Herrera immediately, seated at the far end of the counter, hunched over a drink. She approached casually, sliding into the seat beside him. Herrera barely glanced at her. Not interested, he muttered. Charlotte leaned in slightly. That's funny, because I think you're very interested in a certain kid. That got his attention. His eyes flicked to her, sharp and assessing. I don't know what you're talking about. Charlotte smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. See, that's a problem, because I do. Herrera's fingers tightened around his glass. Then suddenly he pushed off his stool, shoving past her. He was running. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She was after him in an instant, weaving through the crowded bar, dodging a waitress who yelped as Herrera barreled past. He hit the door, shoving it open so hard it nearly bounced off its hinges. Charlotte was right behind him. Herrera ran like a man who had something to lose. Charlotte kept close, her breaths controlled as she pursued him down the sidewalk, past rows of parked cars. The city stretched around them in a blur. Streetlights flickering, the distant wail of a siren cutting through the night. He took a sharp turn down an alley. She followed. They emerged into an open parking lot. Charlotte closed the distance, reaching out. A blinding set of headlights flared to life. The roar of an engine. A dark sedan lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Before Charlotte could react, the car slammed into Herrera. His body lifted off the ground, twisting midair before hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Charlotte skidded to a halt. The sedan didn't stop. It tore off into the night, leaving only the scent of burnt rubber in its wake. She rushed to Herrera's side. Blood pooled beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes flickered open. Charlotte crouched low, gripping his shirt. Who sent you after the boy? He coughed, a wet sound. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Charlotte looked up at the darkened skyline. She needed answers, but her only lead was lying unconscious on the pavement. Dead men tell no tales. Lucky for me, he wasn't dead yet. Charlotte stood in the dimly lit hallway of St. Vincent's Hospital, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her body relaxed, but her mind alert. Hospitals were supposed to be places of healing, but tonight it felt more like a waiting room for the dead. The fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the off-white walls. Herrera was inside, barely clinging to consciousness, a uniformed officer stationed outside his door, a standard precaution when a suspect or witness was involved in an active investigation. Normally, that would have been a problem, but Charlotte had spent years learning how to get through places she wasn't supposed to be. She glanced at the officer, late 40s, thick build, wedding ring. His posture was bored, his grip on his coffee cup loose. He wasn't expecting trouble. Perfect. She pulled out her phone, hit a speed dial, and waited. A second later, the officer's radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Officer Reynolds, possible disturbance at the emergency entrance. We need someone to check it out. The officer groaned, took one last sip of his coffee, and muttered, "Every damn time." He adjusted his belt and walked off. Charlotte slipped inside before the door even clicked shut. Herrera was hooked up to an IV, his face bruised, his right arm bandaged. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes flickered open as she moved toward him. "You," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "Me," she said, pulling up a chair beside him. "You don't look great, Mike." He gave a weak chuckle, then winced. "Feels worse than it looks." "Good," she said flatly. "That means you're still alive, but that can change real fast." His gaze sharpened, just a little. "Threatening a cop? That's bold." Charlotte leaned in. "Not a threat, a fact. You think Graves is going to let you walk away after this? After getting caught on the run?" Herrera swallowed. He knew she was right. She continued, "You're not useful to them anymore, Mike. That means you're expendable. The only way you walk out of here is if you give me something they don't want me to know." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then he exhaled sharply. "You don't get it," he muttered. "This goes beyond Graves, beyond Langston. The kid, he has something big." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "What does Jordan have?" Herrera licked his cracked lips, shifting slightly in the bed. "A USB drive. He stole it. I don't think he even knows what's on it. But whatever it is," he hesitated, glancing toward the door, "it's enough to bring the whole damn system down." She felt the weight of his words settle in. "The network?" she asked. He nodded weakly. "Graves isn't just some dirty cop. He's connected. High level. The kind of power that doesn't just disappear when someone goes to prison. If that USB gets into the wrong hands, people like him will be untouchable forever." Charlotte's mind was already racing. If Jordan really had proof, real proof, then Graves wasn't just after him for cleanup. He was after him to eliminate the threat completely. "They won't stop," Herrera continued, his voice weaker now. "Not until they have it back. And if they can't get it," Charlotte finished for him, "they'll make sure no one else does." Herrera's breathing grew more labored. Whatever pain meds they had him on were wearing off. His eyelids fluttered. "Where's the USB now?" she asked urgently. He tried to speak, but before he could get the words out, a sound cut through the air. A single gunshot. Charlotte's instincts kicked in immediately. She dropped to the floor, pressing herself against the wall as shouts erupted from outside the room. A second later, the door burst open. The officer, Reynolds, stumbled inside, clutching his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers. He gasped, looking at her with wide eyes before collapsing. Charlotte sprang to her feet. Herrera's hospital bed was empty. The sheets were still rumpled, but he was gone. She rushed to the window. It was open. A fresh breeze cut through the sterile hospital air. Herrera had vanished, and outside, somewhere in the night, someone else was hunting for the truth. Whoever got to it first would decide who lived and who disappeared. The closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Charlotte stood in the back corner of a quiet coffee shop, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup that had long since gone cold. The place was nearly empty, save for a barista wiping down the counter and a couple sitting by the window, lost in their own conversation. She wasn't here for coffee. Across from her, Monica Reeves, a seasoned FBI agent with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, studied her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Monica had seen a lot in her years with the Bureau, but this was different. "You're telling me," Monica said, leaning forward slightly, "that a 12-year-old kid is holding on to a piece of evidence that could blow open the biggest corruption case in NYPD history?" Charlotte nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Monica exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Damn it, Charlotte. You realize what this means?" Charlotte didn't need her to spell it out. If the information on that USB was as bad as Herrera had hinted, then Graves wasn't just a dirty cop. He was the front man for something much bigger. Monica's gaze hardened. "FBI's been after Graves for years. We've suspected him of working with organized crime, but every time we get close, the evidence disappears. Witnesses recant. Judges rule against us. We know he's protected, but we've never been able to prove how high it goes. Charlotte set her cup down, watching Monica carefully. If this USB has what I think it does, it's not just Graves. It's his entire network. Monica went still. And you're sure the kid still has it? Charlotte hesitated. I don't know, but I need to find him before Graves does. Monica reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a phone, scrolling through a secure app. If Jordan still has his old burner phone, I might be able to ping the last known location. Charlotte leaned in. Do it. Monica's fingers moved quickly. A few seconds later, she frowned. Got a hit. It's weak, but the last signal came from a warehouse in Brooklyn, near the docks. Charlotte's stomach tightened. That's not a safe place for a kid to hide. Monica's expression darkened. No, it's not. Charlotte stood. I'm going after him. Monica followed. I'm coming with you. The warehouse district was nearly deserted, the streets lined with rusted shipping containers and abandoned loading docks. The distant hum of the city felt miles away. Charlotte and Monica moved quickly, their footsteps light against the cracked pavement. The GPS signal had led them to a long-forgotten storage facility, the kind of place people used to smuggle things in and out of the city unnoticed. Charlotte tested the door. It wasn't locked. She exchanged a look with Monica, then pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of oil. The only light came from the slats in the high windows, casting long, fractured shadows across the concrete floor. Then she saw him. Jordan was curled up in the far corner, his arms wrapped around a battered backpack, his small frame trembling. Charlotte took a slow step forward. Jordan? His head snapped up. His eyes were wide, filled with fear. But the moment he recognized her, something shifted. Relief, but also something else. Panic. You can't be here, he whispered. They're looking for me. Charlotte crouched in front of him. I know. That's why we have to go. Now. Jordan clutched the backpack tighter. They almost got me. A guy grabbed me yesterday, but I got away. I ran here because I didn't know where else to go. Monica knelt beside them. Did they say anything? Did they tell you what they wanted? Jordan hesitated. Then slowly he unzipped the backpack. Inside, beneath crumpled clothes and a few scattered belongings, was a silver USB drive. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Monica before carefully taking it from the bag. You have any idea what's on this? She asked. Jordan shook his head. I just knew it was important. Charlotte pulled out her laptop, plugging the USB in. As the screen lit up, a series of encrypted files appeared, but one folder stood out, labeled with a string of numbers and letters, followed by a single word. Project Tide. She clicked it open. Lines of data scrolled across the screen, financial transactions, offshore accounts, lists of names, Graves, several high-ranking NYPD officials, businessmen, judges. The numbers weren't just money being shuffled around. They were payoffs, bribes, cover-ups. This wasn't just corruption. This was treason. The truth was in my hands. But I wasn't the only one who wanted it. Charlotte moved quickly, tucking the USB into her jacket pocket as she helped Jordan to his feet. The warehouse was no longer safe. If he had been hiding here, it wouldn't take long for Graves' men to track him down. We need to go, she said, keeping her voice calm despite the tension twisting in her gut. Jordan nodded, gripping his backpack tightly, his face pale but determined. Charlotte glanced at Monica. We need a secure location, somewhere off the grid. Monica hesitated for a second, then said, I've got a place. That was all Charlotte needed to hear. They stepped outside into the night, the damp air heavy with the scent of the river nearby. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional flicker of a neon sign casting shifting shadows along the cracked pavement. Then from the corner of her eye, Charlotte saw it, a black SUV. It was parked just down the street, its headlights off, engine idling too quietly to be casual. Move, Charlotte ordered, gripping Jordan's arm and pulling him into motion. They barely made it 3 steps before the SUV lurched forward, tires screeching as it sped toward them. Charlotte reacted on instinct, yanking Jordan to the side just in time to avoid being hit. The vehicle skidded to a halt, and before she could reach for her gun, the doors flew open. 2 men in dark clothing jumped out. One lunged for Jordan. Charlotte intercepted him, slamming her elbow into his ribs before kicking his leg out from under him. He hit the ground hard, groaning. The second man grabbed Jordan by the backpack strap, jerking him backward. "Let me go!" Jordan screamed, twisting in the man's grip. Charlotte reached for her weapon, but before she could draw it, the roar of an approaching engine filled the air. A car screeched around the corner at full speed. Monica, her sedan barreled toward them, forcing the second attacker to let go of Jordan as he leapt out of the way. The moment Jordan was free, Charlotte grabbed him and bolted toward Monica's car. "Get in!" Monica yelled, barely slowing down. Charlotte shoved Jordan into the back seat before diving in herself. The moment her door slammed shut, Monica hit the gas. Bullets ricocheted off the pavement behind them, but they were already speeding away. Monica's safe house was a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was secure. Charlotte paced the living room, her mind racing. "They found us too fast," she muttered. Only a handful of people knew where Jordan was. Monica, standing by the window, exhaled. "You think someone tipped them off?" Charlotte nodded. "Has to be. Graves isn't just guessing. He knew exactly where to send his men." Jordan, still shaken but regaining his composure, sat on the couch, hugging his knees. "What do we do now?" Charlotte pulled out the USB, holding it between her fingers. "We end this," she said. Her phone vibrated. She frowned and pulled it out, glancing at the screen. "Unknown number." She hesitated, then answered. A voice came through, smooth, deliberate. "I know you have it," Graves said. Charlotte's grip on the phone tightened. "Where's the kid?" he asked, almost amused. "He's safe?" Her stomach twisted. He was playing a game. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Graves chuckled. "You already know the answer to that. The question is, how much is his life worth to you?" Charlotte's jaw clenched. "You can walk away, Hale," Graves continued. "Hand it over and this all goes away. You, the boy, your little FBI friend, everyone gets to keep breathing." Charlotte glanced at Jordan. He was watching her, his small hands clenched into fists. She exhaled slowly. "Not happening." There was a pause. Then Graves spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes next." The line went dead. Charlotte lowered the phone. Monica folded her arms. "That sounded like a threat." Charlotte nodded. "It was." She turned back to Jordan, determination hardening her features. "Graves thought he had the upper hand," she said, "but he had no idea what was coming next. Graves thought he could scare me into silence. He was wrong." Charlotte sat in the dim glow of Monica's safe house, her fingers drumming lightly against the wooden table. The weight of the USB in her pocket was heavy, not just physically, but with everything it represented. She had enough evidence to take Graves down, to expose the entire network, but she also knew that power like his didn't crumble easily. She needed a plan, a way to force the truth into the light before Graves could bury it. Across from her, Monica and Ethan sat in tense silence. Ethan, still in his slightly wrinkled suit, looked skeptical. "You want me to put this in your case file?" he asked, rubbing his temple. Charlotte nodded. "If it's part of the official court records, Graves can't make it disappear without raising suspicion. It forces them to acknowledge it exists." Ethan exhaled, considering it. "That's risky. You're already fighting a breaking and entering charge. If this gets thrown out as unrelated, we lose our only shot at using it legally." Charlotte's expression didn't waver. "Then we make it relevant, I testify." Monica, who had been listening quietly, looked up sharply. "Charlotte, think about this. Graves controls half the city. The moment you take the stand, you paint a target on your back." Charlotte leaned forward, voice steady. "That target's already there." Ethan sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You really want to do this?" Charlotte met his gaze. "It's the only way." The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone pillars casting long shadows as Charlotte stepped inside. The air smelled of paper, coffee, and faint traces of old wood polish. Her case had been expedited, likely Graves' way of keeping things moving before she could find a way out. What he didn't realize was that she was about to use that urgency against him. Inside the courtroom, Graves sat at the prosecution's table, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He barely acknowledged her as she entered, but she could feel the weight of his presence. the silent calculation behind his every movement. The judge called for order, and the trial resumed. Ethan stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to submit new evidence into the case file. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa Downey, immediately stood. Objection. This evidence is unrelated to the charges at hand. The judge frowned. Let me see it. Ethan handed over the file containing the USB's contents. The judge skimmed it briefly, then looked up. This appears to be financial records. What does this have to do with the defendant's case? Charlotte stood. Your Honor, these records prove that my arrest was orchestrated by corrupt officers trying to silence me. They show illegal transactions between NYPD officials, including Captain David Graves and known criminal enterprises. Downey shook her head. This trial is about trespassing and obstruction of justice, not police corruption? Charlotte didn't blink. Then let's talk about obstruction of justice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge hesitated, clearly weighing the implications. Graves sat perfectly still, his expression smooth, but Charlotte saw the faintest twitch in his jaw. He hadn't expected this. The judge finally sighed. We'll take a recess. I need time to review this. As the gavel banged, signaling the break, Graves leaned back in his chair, his gaze finally meeting hers. It was a challenge, a silent warning. Charlotte simply stared back. They were trying to silence me, but I wasn't going down that easy. If they wouldn't let me speak in court, I'd make sure the world listened instead. Charlotte sat in the dimly lit apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like an iron grip. The air felt too still, too thick with tension. Across from her, Monica leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her brow furrowed in deep thought. Ethan paced near the window, his phone clutched in one hand, jaw tight as he worked through their next move. They shut us down in court, Ethan muttered. We need a different strategy. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her mind racing. If the system won't listen, we go around it. Ethan turned to face her, nodding slightly. We take it to the public. Monica straightened. That's risky. Graves has influence everywhere. The moment we release this, they'll try to discredit it. Or worse, they'll come after us harder than before. Charlotte wasn't deterred. Then we do it the right way. We leak it to someone who can't be ignored. Ethan set his phone down. I know a guy, Daniel Pierce, investigative journalist. He's been digging into corruption in the NYPD for years, but he's never been able to break through. This would be the story of his career. Monica nodded. And once it's out, Graves can't control it. He can't suppress what's already in the public eye. Charlotte drummed her fingers against the table. Then we do it tonight. Ethan pulled up his contacts ready to make the call, but just as he was about to dial, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. Everyone froze. Monica pulled her gun instantly, moving toward the door. Charlotte grabbed her own weapon, her senses on high alert. Then she noticed something. The front door was slightly ajar. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Monica before stepping forward cautiously, pushing it open the rest of the way. The hallway beyond was empty, no signs of forced entry, no footsteps lingering in the distance. But there was something else. A single piece of paper lay on the floor just inside the threshold. Charlotte bent down, her stomach tightening as she picked it up. The message was handwritten in rough, uneven letters. Bring the USB to the Belmont Hotel. Alone. Her hands clenched around the paper. Something's not right, Monica said, glancing at Ethan. Charlotte barely heard her. Her eyes locked onto a final, chilling line scrawled at the bottom of the note. Or you'll never see the boy again. Charlotte's mind spun, but her instinct stayed sharp. Jordan was gone. She turned sharply toward Monica. Check the back room. Monica disappeared down the hall, her gun raised. A few seconds later, she called back, her voice tight. He's not here, Ethan cursed under his breath. How the hell did they get past us? Charlotte forced herself to stay calm, to think. Graves is getting desperate. He knows I won't hand over the USB willingly, so he's using Jordan as leverage. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. You're not actually considering going, right? You know it's a setup. Charlotte clenched her jaw. Of course it's a setup, but if I don't go, Jordan's as good as dead. Monica reappeared, her face grim. Then we need a plan. Charlotte stared down at the note again, the ink smudged slightly under her grip. I didn't have a choice, she murmured, voice steady. She met Monica's eyes. I was going in. If they wanted me to play their game, fine. But I was playing to win. Charlotte stepped out of the cab in front of the Belmont Hotel, a towering structure of polished glass and steel that gleamed under the city's artificial glow. It reeked of wealth and exclusivity, the kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors, where power didn't just exist, it thrived. The doorman barely gave her a glance as she walked in, her heels clicking against the marble floor. A few well-dressed guests milled about the lobby, sipping drinks and exchanging polite conversation, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. She approached the front desk, her voice cool and even. I have a meeting. The receptionist glanced up, her expression impassive. Name? Charlotte slid the note across the counter. They'll know. The woman barely reacted, nodding slightly before picking up a phone. She muttered something too low to hear, then gestured toward the elevator. Penthouse level, they're expecting you. Charlotte took a steady breath before stepping inside. The moment the doors closed, she reached into her pocket, pressing the small device Monica had given her, a silent ping that activated Jordan's last known GPS signal. Wherever they were holding him, Monica would find out. Now she just had to stall. The penthouse conference room was dimly lit, the soft glow of city lights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A long, sleek table dominated the space, but it wasn't the furniture that held Charlotte's attention. It was David Langston, sitting at the far end, his expression smug, as if he'd already won. Charlotte, he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Please, have a seat. She didn't move. Where's the boy? Langston sighed as if she were being unreasonable. Safe, for now. Charlotte clenched her fists at her sides but kept her face unreadable. And let me guess, he stays that way if I hand over the USB? Langston smiled. Exactly. Charlotte finally stepped forward, lowering herself into the chair across from him, never breaking eye contact. And I'm supposed to believe that if I give it to you, we all just walk away? Langston chuckled, shaking his head. You always were smart. Of course, Graves can't let you walk away, not after everything. But you don't have to die in a gutter, Charlotte. We can make this painless. She tilted her head slightly. Generous. Practical, he corrected. Hand over the USB and we let the kid go. He's just a loose end. We don't need him. Charlotte didn't flinch. And me? Langston leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Well, that depends on how cooperative you are. Charlotte took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully. You know, for someone in your position, you talk an awful lot for yourself. Where's Graves? Langston's jaw twitched. Interesting. Charlotte let her gaze drift downward, past his expensive suit to his wrist. His watch. It was sleek, black, expensive. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the faint, almost imperceptible red light embedded in the side. A recording device. Graves was listening. Of course, he was. He wouldn't send Langston to handle this without keeping a close ear on how it played out. Charlotte's mind raced. If Graves was listening, then this wasn't just a negotiation. It was evidence. She needed to play it right. She leaned back, mirroring Langston's posture, feigning consideration. You know, you could have come yourself, instead of sending your errand boy. Langston's smirk faltered. Good. Charlotte exhaled, tilting her head slightly as if she were mulling over the offer. Let's say I hand over the USB, she said slowly. What happens next? Langston hesitated, just for a second too long. Charlotte's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Not much of a negotiator, are you? What's wrong, Langston? You waiting for Graves to tell you what to say next? Langston's face darkened. You think you're in control here? Charlotte shrugged. I think I'm talking to the wrong person. She lifted her gaze, staring directly at the watch on his wrist. I'm talking directly to Graves. Langston stiffened. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, deliberate. If you're listening, Graves, and I know you are, You should know something. I don't break, and I sure as hell don't bargain with dead men. Langston's expression twisted into something between anger and realization. Charlotte simply smiled. She had just turned the game against them. Graves thought he was in control. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Charlotte sat still, keeping her gaze locked on Langston as the weight of her words settled over the room. The tension thickened, an invisible force pressing down between them. Langston shifted, his fingers curling slightly, as if debating his next move. "You think this is a game, Hale?" Langston muttered, voice lower now, tight with something close to unease. Charlotte tilted her head. "No, Langston, I think this is checkmate." She reached into her pocket and, with one press of a button, turned on the speakerphone. "Graves," she said clearly, her voice sharp. "I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here to show the world exactly who you are." Langston's face twisted in shock, just as the faint, distant echo of sirens pierced the air outside. Charlotte leaned back, watching as realization dawned on him. He wasn't just being listened to, he was being watched. The moment the doors to the penthouse burst open, everything happened at once. Monica Reeves, flanked by a team of FBI agents, stormed inside, weapons drawn. Langston's eyes widened in pure disbelief as two agents grabbed him, forcing him to his feet. "What the hell?" he started, but Monica cut him off. "David Langston, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding a criminal network," she announced, her voice commanding. "We have everything we need. I'd suggest you save your breath for your lawyer." Charlotte rose from her chair, her movements controlled, deliberate. Langston turned toward her, rage flickering beneath his carefully maintained mask. "You set me up," he seethed. Charlotte smiled coldly. "You set yourself up. I just made sure everyone was watching." Langston struggled against the agents, but it was no use. The room buzzed with movement as more officers flooded in, securing the area. Monica nodded toward Charlotte. "Did you get it all?" Charlotte pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen still glowing from the live broadcast. "Oh yeah," she said. "The whole world did." It had been streaming for 13 minutes, long enough for millions of people to witness Graves's corruption in real time. The internet was already exploding. News anchors were scrambling to cover the breaking story, hashtags trending within minutes. And Graves? He couldn't hide. Not anymore. But this wasn't over. Jordan was still out there. Charlotte turned to Monica, who was already speaking into her radio. "We got him," Monica confirmed, looking up. "Jordan's safe." Charlotte exhaled, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a fraction. "Where?" "Warehouse in the docks," Monica said. "Agents secured the location just in time. He's shaken but unharmed." Charlotte nodded, her shoulders finally dropping a little. But even as relief washed over her, something else lingered at the back of her mind. This had been too easy. Graves had planned for everything up until now. There was no way he'd just let this happen without a final move. She turned back to Monica. "Where's Graves?" Monica's expression hardened. "Gone." Charlotte's stomach sank. Langston had been a pawn. The real threat was still out there. And he wasn't done yet. Neither was she. Graves was cornered. But a man like him always had a backup plan. The headlines hit within hours of Langston's arrest. "Corrupt NYPD captain exposed." But is it a smear campaign? High-ranking officials accuse FBI of fabricating evidence. David Graves speaks out. This is a political hit job. Charlotte stared at the news alerts flashing across Monica's laptop screen. Every major outlet was running Graves' version of the story, spinning it just enough to cast doubt. His allies were stepping up, well-rehearsed statements pouring in from politicians, police unions, even a few judges. "This isn't just damage control," Monica muttered. "He's flipping the script." Charlotte exhaled through her nose, watching a clip of Graves at the podium, standing in front of the NYPD headquarters. His voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of a man who had spent years perfecting how to lie convincingly. "These accusations are a disgrace to the men and women who serve this city every day. My record speaks for itself. I have dedicated my life to protecting New York, and now, because of a reckless smear campaign, my career is being torn apart by false evidence and manipulated narratives." The crowd applauded. He was winning them over. Charlotte clenched her jaw. This is what he does, Ethan said from across the room, pacing near the window. He doesn't need to prove he's innocent. He just needs people to doubt us. Monica crossed her arms. And it's working. Charlotte refused to let that happen. We need to hit back, she said. Hard. Something that shuts him down before he can shift the narrative any further. Monica glanced at her. And what exactly do you have in mind? Charlotte tapped the USB sitting on the table. This, she said. Inside the USB was a file they hadn't released yet, one Graves never expected them to have. It was an audio recording, buried deep within encrypted folders. The voice was unmistakable. We keep the city in check. We decide who walks and who rots. If the press starts digging, we feed them a story. If someone steps out of line, we bury them. We don't lose. It was Graves himself, ordering NYPD officers to fabricate cases, protect criminal networks, and eliminate threats before they ever made it to court. Charlotte stared at the file, then at Monica. We put this out there, Charlotte said, and Graves is finished. Ethan nodded. Yeah, if we can get it out before he finds a way to silence us. Monica's expression darkened. Then we'd better move fast. But they weren't fast enough. The second they stepped outside, they were surrounded. Marked police cars, unmarked SUVs, officers in tactical gear, hands on their weapons. A NYPD lieutenant stepped forward, her stance rigid. Charlotte Hale, Monica Reeves. Ethan Cole, she called out. You're under investigation for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud against a senior law enforcement official. Charlotte's pulse spiked. They're arresting us, Ethan whispered. Monica's jaw tightened. This is Graves. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just needs time. Charlotte gritted her teeth. Graves wasn't trying to win. He was trying to make them lose first. If Graves wanted a war, I was going to give him one. Charlotte sat in the back of a dimly lit cafe, fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. The place was quiet, the hum of conversation from a few scattered patrons barely cutting through the low jazz playing overhead. Across from her, Monica scrolled through her phone, scanning updates. The headlines were still dominated by Graves' counterattack, his press conferences, his allies in the NYPD calling for an investigation into fabricated evidence, and the growing narrative that Charlotte and Monica were nothing more than rogue agents with a vendetta. He's winning, Monica muttered, setting the phone down with a frustrated sigh. People are doubting the evidence, and with us under investigation, we can't get this out through official channels. Charlotte didn't flinch. Then we stopped playing by their rules. Monica raised an eyebrow. And do what? Leak it to the press? Charlotte shook her head. Not just any press. We go independent. Someone outside the system, someone who doesn't have corporate ties, political favors, or donors whispering in their ear. Monica considered it for a moment. You have someone in mind? Charlotte pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she landed on a name. Naomi Vasquez, she said. Investigative journalist. She doesn't just break stories, she burns down careers. She's been on Graves for years but never had enough to take him down. We give her what she needs, and she'll make sure the world knows the truth. Monica nodded. That could work, but the USB alone isn't enough. We need someone on the inside, someone with first-hand knowledge who can confirm this in front of a grand jury. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. We need Langston. Monica exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. You think he's going to flip? The guy's been Graves' lapdog for years. Charlotte leaned back, crossing her arms. Langston's loyal to power, not people. And right now, Graves is sinking. If we give Langston a way out, he'll take it. Convincing David Langston to turn on Graves wasn't going to be easy. They met him in a secured federal holding facility where he was being processed for the charges stacked against him. Despite his situation, Langston still carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought he had options. You've got nerve showing up here, he said as Charlotte and Monica entered the room. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. What, come to gloat? Charlotte pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Come to make you an offer. Langston smirked. I don't take offers from people who got me locked up. Monica leaned forward. That's funny, because last I checked, Graves isn't bailing you out. In fact, I bet he hasn't even called. Langston's smirk faltered, just for a second. Charlotte pressed on. You know what he's doing right now? Cleaning up his mess. And you're just another loose end. Langston exhaled sharply through his nose, looking away. Charlotte knew she had hit the right nerve. You help us, she continued, and we help you. Testify against Graves. Tell the jury what you know, and we'll make sure you don't spend the rest of your life in a cell. Langston let the silence stretch between them before finally shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. You really think I'd betray him just to save myself? Charlotte tilted her head. I think you already know he'd do it to you. Langston's jaw clenched. He said nothing, but the flicker of hesitation in his eyes told Charlotte everything she needed to know. Clock's ticking, Langston, she said. Either you go down with him, or you walk away with a deal. Langston looked away for a long moment, then sighed. Fine, he muttered. I'll testify. The courtroom was packed. Media lined the aisles. Reporters filled the benches, cameras capturing every second. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that came before a historic moment, before something irreversible. Langston sat on the witness stand, hands folded neatly in his lap, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet calculation. He knew this was his last chance to control his own fate. The prosecutor approached, voice steady. Mr. Langston, you worked under Captain David Graves for over a decade. Can you confirm your involvement in the corruption scheme detailed in the evidence provided to the court? Langston cleared his throat. Yes. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel once for silence. And can you confirm that Captain Graves personally ordered the falsification of police reports, the obstruction of justice, and the protection of organized crime figures in exchange for financial kickbacks? Langston hesitated, just for a breath, before leaning toward the microphone. Yes, he said. He did. Another murmur, this time louder. And do you have first-hand knowledge of these orders? Langston exhaled slowly. I wasn't just following orders, he admitted. I was part of it. But Graves was the one pulling the strings. He made sure the right people walked and the wrong ones disappeared. The prosecutor took a measured step closer. And are you willing to testify under oath that Captain Graves personally directed these actions? Langston nodded once. Yes. The reaction was instant. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The judge leaned forward, suddenly paying much closer attention. The jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. The case wasn't just about Charlotte anymore. It was about all of it. The corruption, the cover-ups, the crimes hidden beneath the shield of authority. And now it was out in the open. Graves sat in the back of the courtroom, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control anymore. Graves was finally in the courtroom, but justice wasn't guaranteed yet. Charlotte sat in the gallery, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable as she watched the trial unfold before her. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, every seat occupied by journalists, legal experts, and curious onlookers eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. At the defense table, David Graves sat with an air of controlled confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral. But Charlotte saw it, the faint stiffness in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes when the first witness was called. The prosecution opened strong, laying out the overwhelming evidence against him. Financial records, testimonies from former officers. The USB files Charlotte had risked everything to expose. But Graves wasn't going down without a fight. His attorneys attacked Charlotte and Monica's credibility, painting them as rogue agents on a personal vendetta. This entire case is built on the word of a disgraced CIA agent and a federal officer under internal investigation, one of his lawyers argued, pacing before the jury. Miss Hale has a long history of operating outside the law. How can we be sure this isn't just another one of her reckless crusades? Charlotte didn't flinch, but she could feel the shift in the room. The jury hesitated. Some of them were buying it. Graves leaned back in his chair, his expression cool. He knew that reasonable doubt was his only way out. If he could make the jury question the motives behind the evidence, he could walk free. And for a moment, Charlotte felt it slipping away, until they called Langston to the stand. David Langston wasn't the same man he had been weeks ago. Gone was the arrogance, the blind loyalty to Graves. He sat at the witness stand, hands clasped together, his shoulders tense but steady. The prosecutor approached, her voice sharp. "Mr. Langston, you worked under Captain Graves for over a decade. Can you confirm your direct involvement in the operations under his command?" Langston's throat bobbed as he swallowed, then he nodded. "Yes." A murmur ran through the room. "And can you confirm," the prosecutor continued, "that Captain Graves personally ordered the obstruction of justice, manipulation of police records, and the protection of known criminal organizations?" Langston exhaled slowly. "Yes." Graves didn't move, but Charlotte saw his fingers tighten against the edge of the defense table. "And do you have evidence to support this claim?" Langston hesitated, then pulled something from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, a small recording device. Charlotte felt her pulse spike. Langston's voice was steady as he placed it on the evidence table. "I recorded everything," he said. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the whispers and gasps didn't stop. The prosecutor took the device, pressing play. And then Graves' voice filled the courtroom. "We keep this city in check. We decide who walks and who rots. If the press starts digging, we feed them a story. If someone steps out of line, we bury them. We don't lose." The room went dead silent. Graves's mask of control cracked. His attorneys scrambled for objections, but it was too late. The jury was listening. They were hearing the real Graves, and there was no coming back from it. The judge called a recess as Graves' legal team tried to contain the fallout, but the damage was done. When they reconvened, Graves tried to negotiate. His lawyers proposed a plea deal, hoping for reduced sentencing. The prosecutor didn't even hesitate. "Denied." Charlotte watched as reality finally settled over Graves. Justice isn't about winning. It's about making sure it never happens again. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The gavel had fallen, the reporters had swarmed, and the public had gotten their verdict. David Graves was convicted on multiple charges: corruption, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. A man who had once held the city in the palm of his hand now faced decades behind bars. Charlotte watched from the back of the room as the last of the press filtered out, their voices still buzzing about the historic ruling. It should have felt like a victory, but victories in this world were never clean. She stepped outside, greeted by the crisp autumn air, the city still humming with life. It hadn't changed. Not really. People went on with their days, taxis honked, distant sirens wailed. New York didn't stop for anyone, and corruption didn't end with one conviction. Inside the courthouse, Jordan sat in a waiting area, gripping a small backpack, his legs swinging slightly. His face had lost some of its fear, but his eyes still held the weight of everything he had seen. Charlotte crouched in front of him. "You okay?" Jordan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, it's weird. He's going to jail, right?" "Yeah," she said. "He is." Jordan glanced down, fidgeting with his backpack strap. "So, what happens to me now?" Charlotte looked over at Monica, who stood nearby, arms crossed. They had discussed this already. Jordan would be placed with a foster family, a safe one, far from the reach of the people who had tried to use him. Monica had made sure of it. "You're getting a fresh start," Charlotte told him. "Somewhere safe, somewhere you don't have to run anymore." Jordan's grip tightened on his bag. "And you? You're not gonna disappear, right?" Charlotte hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulling out a small burner phone. She placed it in his hand. "If you ever need me," she said, "I'll be there." Jordan held the phone like it was something precious. "Thanks," he whispered. She gave his shoulder a squeeze before standing up. Monica stepped in, ruffling Jordan's hair. "Come on, kid. Let's get you home." Monica was the last to leave the courthouse, lingering by the steps as Charlotte stared out at the city. "You're not done, are you?" Monica asked. Charlotte exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "Not even close." Monica smirked. "Figured. You know, this thing was bigger than Graves. There are others. People who let him do what he did. People who are already scrambling to cover their tracks." Charlotte turned toward her. "You got names?" Monica slipped a small envelope into Charlotte's jacket pocket. I always have names, she said. Charlotte nodded. Then let's make sure Graves was just the beginning. Monica gave her a knowing look before heading down the stairs, disappearing into the crowd. Charlotte stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of it all. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, expecting a call from Ethan, or maybe Monica again. Instead, it was a blocked number, and one message. This wasn't just Graves. We need to talk. Charlotte's stomach tightened. She looked up past the courthouse, past the traffic, past the city that never stopped moving. Justice had been served, but she wasn't done yet. Justice isn't just about bringing down one man. It's about dismantling the system that allowed him to rise in the first place. Charlotte knew that Graves' conviction wasn't the end of the fight. Corruption doesn't disappear overnight. It hides, it shifts, it finds new faces. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and those who stand for justice have to be willing to fight for it, again and again. So what do you think? Is justice ever truly served, or is it something we have to keep chasing? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have plenty more coming your way.